May 23, 1944, 0317 hours, Château de Tilly, Normandy, France. Hauptmann Klaus von Müller lowered his binoculars and wiped the condensation from the lenses with trembling hands. Through the pre-dawn mist, he could see what his Abwehr intelligence training had taught him to recognize, the unmistakable signs of a major Allied armored concentration. 43 Sherman tanks, 18 half-tracks, 6 self-propelled artillery pieces, all positioned exactly where a competent commander would stage them for an assault on the German 352nd Infantry Division's positions near Brest. He had photographed the positions from 3 angles. He had counted vehicle exhaust plumes in the cold morning air. He had even crept close enough to hear the distinctive rumble of American radial engines idling, the metallic clink of track maintenance, the voices of soldiers speaking English with American accents. "Herr Hauptmann," his radio man whispered, "we should report immediately. This is at least a full armored regiment, perhaps 2. Von Müller nodded, already composing the intelligence report in his mind. The report that would redirect 2 Panzer divisions to defend against an American armored thrust that would never come. The report that would leave the actual invasion route weakly defended. The report based on an army that didn't exist. What von Müller couldn't know, what German intelligence would never discover until after the war, was that those 43 tanks were inflatable rubber. Those half-tracks were painted canvas stretched over wooden frames, and those engine sounds came from phonograph recordings played through enormous speakers hidden in the trees. He was watching the 23rd, Headquarters Special Troops at work, the Ghost Army. 1,100 American soldiers who would execute over 20 tactical deceptions across Europe, tying down tens of thousands of German troops chasing phantoms and saving an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives through the most ambitious con job in military history. The mathematics of invasion made deception not just useful, but essential. For D-Day to succeed, the Allies needed to convince Hitler that Normandy was a feint, that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, 150 miles to the northeast. Traditional deception relied on camouflage and concealment, hiding what you had. But Operation Fortitude required something far more ambitious, creating entire armies that didn't exist, making the enemy see what wasn't there, and sustaining that illusion for months under the scrutiny of German aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and ground observation. The problem was scale. To convince German intelligence that an entire army group threatened Calais, the Allies needed to simulate approximately 150,000 troops, 1,000 plus tanks and armored vehicles, 400 plus artillery pieces, 400 plus aircraft, hundreds of landing craft, multiple division headquarters with full radio traffic, realistic troop movements, training exercises, and supply operations. Creating this phantom force through traditional means, actual equipment positioned as decoys, would require resources almost equal to a real army. The solution had to be different. It had to be impossible. It had to be art. The answer came from an unlikely source: art schools, advertising agencies, and Hollywood studios. In early 1944, the U.S. Army began recruiting soldiers with backgrounds in design, illustration, theater, and audio engineering. The official designation was bland: 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The mission was extraordinary: use creativity, technology, and psychology to make the German Wehrmacht see entire armies where only 1,000 men stood. They would paint fake insignias on real vehicles. They would inflate rubber tanks indistinguishable from real Shermans at 200 yards. They would broadcast recordings of armored divisions on the move. They would impersonate generals. They would become the most successful con artists in military history. By war's end, this unit of artists and designers would have conducted 21 battlefield deceptions, sometimes operating within earshot of enemy positions, always one mistake away from catastrophe. German intelligence would redirect entire divisions based on their illusions. Field commanders would plan operations around phantom threats. The Ghost Army's secret would remain classified for 50 years, their extraordinary story locked away until the soldiers themselves were elderly men. Their war a fading memory that no one would believe when finally revealed. But on this morning in May 1944, as Hauptmann von Müller radioed his urgent report about American armor concentrations that existed only as rubber and canvas, the largest deception in warfare history was just beginning. The deception imperative. Military deception was as old as warfare itself. Joshua's trumpets at Jericho, the Trojan horse, Washington's campfires at Trenton. But World War II demanded deception at unprecedented scale. The problem facing Allied planners in 1943 was mathematical and brutal. German coastal defenses stretched from Norway to Spain, 2,400 miles of fortified coastline. Even with total Allied superiority in men and materiel, assaulting the Atlantic Wall directly would result in catastrophic casualties. The solution, proposed by British Colonel Dudley Clark and refined by Joint Security Control in Washington, was Operation Bodyguard, the overall deception plan for the invasion of Europe. Its core principle: make the Germans defend everywhere by making them believe the attack could come from anywhere. Lieutenant Colonel Hilton Rayleigh, a former public relations executive from New York, received orders in January 1944 that would have seemed insane in peacetime. Create a unit capable of simulating entire divisions through tactical deception. Budget, minimal. Timeline, immediately. Security classification, absolutely secret. Rayleigh understood that traditional military deception, camouflage netting, dummy positions, wouldn't work at the scale needed. The solution required thinking like an advertising campaign, not a military operation. "We're not trying to fool a single observer," Rayleigh wrote in a classified memo preserved in the National Archives. "We're trying to fool an entire intelligence apparatus: aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, ground observation, and captured prisoners. Every element must be perfect, or the whole illusion collapses." The recruitment. The call went out through unusual channels. Art schools received inquiries about students with technical skills. Advertising agencies were asked about employees with military age. Hollywood studios found Army recruiters asking about set designers and sound engineers. Private Arthur Shilstone, a commercial illustrator from New York, recalled his recruitment in a 1985 interview. "An officer asked if I could paint. I said yes, I was a professional illustrator. He asked if I could paint a 2.5-ton truck to look like a 30-ton tank. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't." By March 1944, Fort Meade, Maryland became home to the strangest military unit in American history. 379 soldiers from the Sonic Deception Company, audio engineers and technicians. 296 soldiers from the Special Engineer Task Force, camouflage and visual deception specialists. 168 soldiers from the Signal Company Special, radio operators for phantom traffic. 257 soldiers from combat and support units to provide security and logistics. The average IQ of the unit was 119, compared to an Army average of 100. Many had college degrees, extraordinary for enlisted men in 1944. Some spoke multiple languages. Several were professional artists whose paintings now hang in major museums. Staff Sergeant Bill Blass would become a famous fashion designer after the war. Private Ellsworth Kelly would become one of America's most celebrated abstract painters. The unit included fashion photographers, stage designers, and audio engineers who had worked on Broadway productions. Training began with the impossible: simulate an entire armored division using 1,100 men and equipment that could be transported in a few dozen trucks. The visual deception equipment was ingenious and absurd in equal measure. Inflatable tanks. Designed by Goodyear and U.S. Rubber Company, these rubber shells could be inflated with air pumps in 15 minutes. From 200 yards through aerial reconnaissance cameras, they were indistinguishable from real M4 Shermans. Each weighed 85 pounds and cost $1,000, a fraction of the $50,000 cost of a real tank. The unit eventually deployed with approximately 600 inflatable vehicles, including tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. Sound effects. The most sophisticated equipment was the heater. Engineers from Bell Laboratories had recorded real armored units on the move. Tank treads on different surfaces, engine sounds, radio chatter, maintenance activities. These recordings were played through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks, capable of projecting sound up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. Radio deception. Perhaps the most critical element was spoof radio. Operators who impersonated entire division headquarters, creating realistic radio traffic with proper call signs, codes, and communication patterns. A real armored division generated approximately 300 to 400 radio messages daily. The Ghost Army's signal specialists had to simulate this traffic perfectly, or German radio intelligence would immediately detect the deception. Early tests were catastrophic failures. At Fort Meade in April 1944, the first full-scale deception exercise was observed by Colonel Billy Harris, an armor officer brought in to evaluate realism. His report was damning. Inflatable tanks visible as fakes within 100 yards. Sound recordings unconvincing, too perfect, no mechanical variations. Radio traffic patterns wrong, too organized, lacking normal military confusion. Assessment. Current capability would fool no competent intelligence officer for more than 6 hours. The perfection problem. The Ghost Army faced a paradox that threatened the entire concept. Perfect deception was obviously fake. Real military operations were messy. Tank formations had stragglers. Radio communications had mistakes, repetitions, interruptions. Camps had trash, wear patterns, the accumulated disorder of hundreds of men living in the field. The first inflatable tank demonstrations were too perfect. They were positioned in mathematically precise formations that no real unit would achieve. They were pristine, without the mud, wear, and damage that marked real combat vehicles. From 1,000 feet, a trained photo interpreter could spot the deception immediately, not because the fakes were crude, but because they were too good. Technical Sergeant Victor Dowd, a former stage designer from Broadway, identified the problem. We were thinking like artists, creating perfect illusions. We needed to think like soldiers, creating perfect imperfection. The solution required understanding how real units operated, then replicating not just their equipment, but their behavior, patterns, and mistakes. Major Ralph Ingersoll, the unit's commanding officer and former publisher of PM magazine, brought his journalistic eye to the problem. He embedded Ghost Army teams with real armored divisions for 2 weeks in April 1944, documenting everything. They learned tank crews always parked in the same relative positions to each other, crew cohesion. Experienced units had more maintenance activity visible than green units. Real camps had pathways worn by foot traffic, not geometric road patterns. Radio operators had individual fists, distinctive sending patterns like handwriting. Officers' vehicles were cleaner than enlisted vehicles. Latrines were positioned downwind and at specific distances. Supply dumps grew organically, not in organized rows. Real soldiers created unauthorized shortcuts, not textbook deployments. Every detail had to be replicated, or German intelligence would see through the illusion. But learning what made deception believable was useless if the unit couldn't survive in combat conditions. The Ghost Army wasn't designed for fighting. They carried minimal weapons and no heavy equipment. If discovered by German forces, they would be slaughtered. The first opportunity to prove themselves came in June 1944, immediately after D-Day, when the Ghost Army was rushed to France with orders to help create the deception that would save the invasion, convincing the Germans that Normandy was a feint, that Patton's Phantom First Army Group would still land at Calais. What happened next would transform skepticism into belief, art school students into soldiers, and the Ghost Army from experimental curiosity into essential weapon. Operation Elephant, July 1st to 2nd, 1944. The Ghost Army's first combat mission began 24 days after D-Day, as Allied forces struggled to break out of Normandy's hedgerow country. On June 30th, Colonel Harry Reeder assembled the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops in an apple orchard near Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte. German artillery could be heard in the distance. Some of the artists, fresh from New York studios and Hollywood sets, were visibly nervous. "Tomorrow morning," Reeder announced, "we will simulate the 2nd Armored Division moving toward Caumont. This will convince the Germans that a major attack is coming from that direction. The actual attack will come from the opposite direction, where the Germans will have weakened their defenses." "And if the Germans attack us?" asked Private First Class Arthur Shilstone, the commercial illustrator. "Then you'll discover if rubber tanks stop real bullets," Reeder replied dryly. "They don't. Stay hidden. The illusion only works from a distance." Operation Elephant began at 5:30 on July 1st. The Ghost Army had 6 hours to create the illusion of an entire armored division before German morning reconnaissance flights. The choreography was precise. Visual Team, 0530 to 0800. Deployed 96 inflatable Sherman tanks in tactical positions, simulating a division staging area. Positioned real vehicles, with 2nd Armored Division markings at road intersections where German ground observation could spot them. Created tank tracks using specialized rollers pulled by jeeps, making parallel grooves in mud that matched real tank treads. Hung laundry near troop areas, a detail based on observation that soldiers always created unofficial clotheslines. Set up inflatable artillery pieces positioned exactly as fire support would be placed for an actual assault. Sonic Team, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. broadcast recordings of tank maintenance activities from hidden positions in tree lines, played sounds of tracked vehicles, moving at night, synchronized with the visual deception's supposed timeline, created audio signatures of a division preparing for assault, radio chatter, shouted orders, equipment testing. Radio team, 0400 ongoing, began transmitting in the communications pattern of the 2nd Armored Division headquarters. Operators who had studied actual 2nd Armored radio traffic for weeks replicated not just call signs, but individual operators sending rhythms, generating 300-plus messages in the first 12 hours, matching normal Armored Division communication volume. Special operations, 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. Officers wearing 2nd Armored Division patches drove through nearby French villages in jeeps, asking loudly about road conditions toward Caumont. Accidentally left maps in a cafe with attack plans marked, maps designed to be discovered. Had enlisted men visit local establishments, drinking and complaining about the upcoming assault, carefully scripted conversations that villagers would repeat to anyone asking. By 9 a.m., German aerial reconnaissance flights photographed the armored concentration. The photographs would reach 7th Army headquarters by noon. Lieutenant Karl Westhoff, a Luftwaffe photo interpreter attached to the 352nd Infantry Division, examined the images that afternoon. His analysis, preserved in captured German documents at the National Archives. Concentration of 40 to 50 armored vehicles, staging area pattern consistent with divisional assault preparation. Estimate 1 armored regiment minimum, possibly full division. Vehicle disposition suggests assault directed toward Caumont-l'Evêque within 24 to 48 hours. Recommend immediate reinforcement of the 352nd Infantry Division sector. Based on this assessment, German commanders shifted 2 infantry battalions and 1 artillery battalion to defend against the expected assault. These forces were pulled from the sector where the actual American attack would come the following day. Operation Elephant's success was measured in silence. The Germans never mentioned discovering the deception. Radio intercepts showed they had reinforced exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them. The real attack, launched July 2nd from the weakly defended sector, achieved total tactical surprise. But the Ghost Army soldiers, hiding in foxholes while German reconnaissance planes photographed their inflatable tanks, learned critical lessons. Private Harold Dahl, a former Minneapolis advertising designer, recorded in his diary, "Lying in a ditch while a Luftwaffe plane circles your rubber tank at 500 feet is when you truly appreciate quality craftsmanship. If that inflation seam had been visible from above, we'd all be dead." The artists become soldiers. The transformation from artists into combat deceivers revealed itself in individual stories that captured the unit's unique character. Private Bill Blass, the fashion designer. Before the war, William Ralph Blass had been making his way in New York fashion industry. At 22, he was already designing for Anna Miller and Company. The Army classified him as a camoufleur, a designation that didn't exist in military manuals before 1943. His specialty became atmosphere, the small details that made fake camps believable. He understood that fashion was about creating complete illusions, and so was deception. During Operation Bouzonville in September 1944, Blass was responsible for simulating an infantry division headquarters. His insight: real headquarters had status. Officers kept things cleaner, more organized than enlisted areas. He requisitioned white paint, technically against regulations for forward areas, and had his team paint rocks to mark a headquarters parking area. He created a motor pool, where vehicles were arranged not by tactical necessity, but by military formality. Generals' vehicles in front, staff vehicles in rows by rank. German intelligence photographs showed these details. Their assessment noted, "Organized headquarters visible, indicates experienced division-level command element." After the war, Blass rarely spoke about his service, but in a 1985 interview he observed, "Fashion and military deception aren't that different. Both are about making people see what you want them to see and not question it. A well-designed dress makes you look at the woman wearing it a certain way. A well-designed deception makes the enemy deploy their forces where you want them." Sergeant Arthur Shilstone, the illustrator. Shilstone had been a commercial illustrator for Collier's Weekly and other magazines. The Army valued his technical drawing skills, but Shilstone discovered his real talent was observation. He became the unit's error correction specialist, the soldier who walked through deception sites looking for mistakes that would reveal the fraud. During Operation Brest in August 1944, Shilstone caught a critical error that could have destroyed the entire illusion. Walking through a fake armored bivouac at dawn, he noticed that inflatable tanks cast shadows that didn't change with the sun angle, because the internal air pressure kept them exactly the same shape regardless of temperature or time of day. Real tanks, warming in the sun, had metal that expanded minutely. Crews opened hatches. Tracks settled into soil differently as temperatures changed. The environment affected them. Shillstone's solution was low-tech. He had crews reposition inflatable tanks every 4 hours, rotating them slightly, moving them a few feet. This created the impression of normal maintenance activities while preventing the frozen shadow problem. His innovation was adopted Army-wide. Field Manual 20-10, Camouflage and Concealment, revised in October 1944, included provisions based on Shillstone's observations about maintaining dynamic deception. After the war, Shillstone became one of America's most celebrated historical illustrators. His paintings hang in the Pentagon, West Point, and the National Guard Heritage Gallery, but he credited his military service with teaching him observation. I learned to see not just what was there, but what should be there. Every painting I've done since carries that lesson. Private First Class Ellsworth Kelly, the abstract artist. Kelly had studied at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn before being drafted. The Army initially assigned him to a standard engineering unit, but his artistic background flagged him for the Ghost Army. Kelly's contribution was different from most. His abstract approach to visual design made him perfect for creating camouflage patterns that broke up vehicle silhouettes without looking obviously artificial. He developed disruption painting, patterns that used natural colors in unnatural arrangements to confuse the eye about vehicle type and size. A half-track painted with Kelly's patterns might appear to aerial reconnaissance as a truck, or vice versa. His most significant contribution came during Operation Dallas in September 1944, when the Ghost Army needed to simulate armored vehicles under camouflage netting. Kelly designed patterns that, from aerial photographs, created the illusion of specific vehicle types under partial concealment, the way real units would camouflage equipment. German photo interpreters identified specific tank types under netting that didn't exist, fooled by patterns that suggested shape without revealing enough detail to prove the identification wrong. Kelly later said the war taught him the power of suggestion, showing just enough to make the viewer's mind complete the image. His post-war artwork, characterized by hard-edge forms and brilliant colors, reflected lessons learned creating military deceptions. Technical Sergeant Harold Lehner, the sound engineer. Lehner had worked for NBC Radio in New York before the war, engineering sound effects for radio dramas. The Army recognized his expertise with acoustics was exactly what the sonic deception unit needed. His challenge was making recordings of tank movements sound like live maneuvers. The problem wasn't quality. The recordings were excellent. The problem was they sounded too much like recordings, too clean, too consistent. Real tank units generated random sounds, engines misfiring, transmissions grinding, soldiers cursing when equipment failed. Recordings were perfect performances, and therefore obviously fake to trained German listening posts. Lehner's solution was to create living recordings. He'd play multiple recordings simultaneously at different volumes, add live sounds, soldiers moving equipment, shouted orders, and vary playback speeds slightly to simulate equipment inconsistency. During Operation Wiltz, in October 1944, German listening posts reported hearing American armored units moving at night exactly where the Ghost Army was broadcasting. The sonic deception was so convincing that German artillery fired preemptive barrages at empty fields, wasting ammunition on phantom targets. After the war, Lehner became a pioneer in stereo recording technology. He credited his military experience. "I learned that perfect sound is less believable than imperfect sound. The ear trusts mistakes." By September 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted 8 successful deceptions. They had simulated divisions, confused German intelligence, and contributed to tactical victories without firing a shot. But their greatest challenge and most dangerous mission was approaching. In Luxembourg, the Third Army needed a miracle, convincing the Germans that 4 divisions were still holding positions that had actually been vacated for Patton's drive toward Germany. If the deception failed, German forces would discover a massive gap in Allied lines and could counterattack into the American rear, potentially cutting off Patton's entire army. The Ghost Army would have to maintain the illusion for 8 days, operating within artillery range of German positions, with only 1,100 men simulating 40,000. It would be the most ambitious tactical deception in history, and one mistake would expose them to annihilation. September 14th to 22nd, 1944. Luxembourg General George S. Patton stood in the operations tent at 3rd Army headquarters, studying the map of Luxembourg with undisguised frustration. His armored spearheads had advanced so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. He needed to pull 4 divisions, the 83rd Infantry, 5th Armored, 95th Infantry, and 95th Infantry, back for refitting and resupply. This created a problem that conventional military thinking couldn't solve. Withdrawing 40,000 men would create a 30-mile gap in the line. If German intelligence detected this, enemy forces could attack into the American rear, cutting Patton's supply lines and potentially destroying his entire army. Colonel Billy Harris, 3rd Army's deception officer, proposed something unprecedented. Use the Ghost Army to simulate all 4 divisions simultaneously while the real units withdrew. Patton's response, recorded in his diary, was characteristic. Harris wants to hold my flank with rubber tanks and phonograph records. This is either brilliant or insane, probably both. Tell them they have 8 days to convince the Germans I still have 40,000 men where I'll have 1,100 boys with balloons. On September 14th, Colonel Harry Reeder assembled the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops near Luxembourg City. The mission brief was stark. You will simulate 4 divisions across a 30-mile front. German observation posts are within 800 yards of some positions. You will maintain this deception for 8 to 10 days while real divisions withdraw and refit. If the Germans discover the deception and attack, there are no reserves. You will be overrun. The scale was staggering. The Ghost Army had never attempted to simulate more than 1 division at a time. 4 divisions required. 400 plus inflatable tanks and vehicles deployed simultaneously. Radio traffic simulating 4 separate division headquarters. Visual evidence of 40,000 troops across 30 miles. Sound effects suggesting normal divisional activities at multiple locations. Maintenance of the deception around the clock for over a week. Technical Sergeant Victor Dowd mapped out the deception like a Broadway production, with precise timing, positioning, and performance schedules. Act 1, September 14th to 15th, the switch. As real divisions began withdrawing after dark, Ghost Army units moved into their positions. The timing had to be perfect. Any gap in radio traffic or visible activity would alert German signals intelligence. The solution was a rolling replacement. As one real battalion pulled out, Ghost Army radio operators immediately began broadcasting in that unit's communication pattern. Visual teams had inflatable equipment positioned and inflated within 2 hours of real units departing. Sergeant Bill Blass orchestrated the visual deception for the 83rd Infantry Division sector. His team faced a unique challenge. Infantry divisions had different signatures than armored divisions. Fewer vehicles, more foot traffic, different camp layouts. Blass's solution was ingenious and dangerous. He had soldiers walk patrol routes at regular intervals, visible to German observation. But with only 275 soldiers to simulate 14,000, each man walked multiple patrol routes wearing different company insignia, creating the illusion of many separate units. We became actors, Blass later recalled, performing for an audience that would kill us if they didn't believe the performance. Act 2, September 16th to 18th, selling the illusion. The Ghost Army's challenge wasn't just creating a snapshot deception. It was maintaining a living, evolving illusion across 8 days. Real divisions had rhythm, morning formations, meal times, guard changes, maintenance schedules, supply deliveries. German intelligence had been watching these patterns for weeks. Any deviation would trigger suspicion. Corporal Ned Harris, a former Broadway stage manager, created what he called the division's daily schedule, a minute-by-minute script of activities that each simulated division would perform. 0600, morning formation sounds, recordings. Vehicles starting, selected real vehicles mixed with recordings. 0630, mess activity, soldiers visible moving to designated mess areas, smoke from cooking fires. 0800, radio traffic increases, matches real division pattern. 0900 to 1100, maintenance activity, soldiers visible working on vehicles, parts positioned for aerial observation. 1200, mess activity, second meal period. 1400, tactical radio exercises, simulates division training. 1700, guard mount, visible formation. 1800, evening mess. 2000 to 0600, reduced activity, guard rotations, occasional vehicle movements. Every activity was carefully staged for German observation. But the real genius was in the mistakes. Private Arthur Shilstone deliberately created errors that real units would make. Left one inflatable tank deflated for 4 hours, then had a repair crew re-inflate it, simulating maintenance. Positioned one section of vehicles incorrectly according to tactical doctrine, matching common deployment errors. Had soldiers create an unauthorized pathway between two company areas. Real soldiers always created shortcuts. These imperfections made the deception believable. German photo interpreters saw not a perfect deployment, but the messy reality of actual divisions. Act 3, September 19th to 21st. The crisis. On September 19th, German artillery began targeting the Ghost Army positions. At 14:30, shells landed within 200 yards of an inflatable tank concentration near Bettemberg. The Ghost Army had minimal counter-battery capability. They couldn't return fire without revealing their actual strength. Colonel Reeder faced an impossible choice: withdraw and collapse the deception, or hold position and hope German fire didn't get more accurate. He chose to stay. But he added a critical element to the deception. Using their few real vehicles, Ghost Army soldiers drove to positions where German observation could see them, then deliberately moved as if redeploying to avoid artillery. They created the impression that an entire battalion was repositioning, exactly what a real unit would do under fire. German artillery followed the repositioning units, firing at new locations where only a handful of real vehicles maneuvered among inflatable decoys. The Ghost Army was literally dodging artillery fire with a shell game. Private First Class Jack Macy, a designer from New York, described the experience. "We're sitting in foxholes while German shells land on our rubber tanks. One direct hit, and the tank just deflates like a birthday balloon. We'd wait for the shelling to stop, then re-inflate it. The Germans never figured out why their artillery wasn't destroying our armor." The German perspective. Captured. German intelligence reports, discovered in archives after the war, revealed how completely the deception worked. From 7th Army Intelligence Assessment, September 20th, 1944. American forces in Luxembourg sector maintain full strength. 4 divisions identified through radio traffic analysis, aerial reconnaissance, and ground observation. Units show normal activity patterns, no indication of withdrawal or weakening. Recommend continued defensive posture. Oberst Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heide, commanding German reconnaissance units in the sector, later provided the most revealing testimony. In a post-war interview, he stated, "We watched the American positions for 8 days. We saw vehicles moving, heard tanks in maintenance, intercepted radio traffic from 4 division headquarters. We photographed their positions from the air. Every indicator confirmed 4 divisions held the line. After the war, I learned we were watching 1,100 men with inflatable tanks. It's impossible to accept, except that it happened. They fooled our entire intelligence apparatus. If they could do that, perhaps we were always destined to lose this war." The doctrine spreads Operation Bettemberg's success transformed the Ghost Army from experimental unit to essential weapon. 3rd Army requested them for every major operation. Other Allied armies wanted similar capabilities. Between September and December 1944, the 23rd conducted 15 separate deception operations. Operation Wiltz, October 12th to 22nd, simulated 75th Infantry Division, convincing Germans that Allied forces in the Ardennes were stronger than actual strength. This deception would have tragic irony. The weakly defended sector the Ghost Army was simulating strength in would become the center of the Battle of the Bulge 2 months later. Operation Dallas, October 7th to 10th, created phantom buildup near Metz, drawing German reserves away from actual attack axis. The operation involved 550 inflatable vehicles, the largest single deployment of decoy equipment in the war. Operation Elsborn, November 3rd to 6th, simulated armored reserves behind First Army lines, discouraging German counterattacks. German prisoners later reported that their commanders had canceled planned assaults specifically because of the American armored reserves the Ghost Army had simulated. Each operation refined techniques. The unit developed new equipment, improved procedures, and trained replacement personnel in increasingly sophisticated deception methods. By December 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted 17 combat deceptions, simulated 13 different divisions, deployed in 8 different sectors across France, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Never been discovered by German intelligence. Contributed to tactical victories that saved an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 Allied lives. But they had also developed dangerous confidence, operating so close to German lines, successfully fooling enemy intelligence repeatedly. They began to believe they were invincible. That confidence would be tested in the frozen forests of Belgium, where the largest German offensive of the war would sweep over their positions. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Battle of the Bulge. The attack came exactly where the Ghost Army had simulated Phantom divisions 2 months earlier. Now, as German armor smashed through the Ardennes, the Ghost Army received emergency orders. Deploy immediately to create the illusion that massive American reinforcements were arriving, buying time for real units to redeploy. But this time, they would operate not behind safe lines, but in active combat zones, where German reconnaissance patrols could stumble upon their positions at any moment, where one captured soldier could reveal the entire deception, where death was measured in yards, not miles. The artists were about to become not just soldiers, but combat soldiers, holding the line with nothing but imagination and inflatable tanks against the largest German offensive of the war. December 18th to 23rd, 1944. Belgium. The Ghost Army's trucks rolled through falling snow and streams of refugees fleeing east. Behind them, German artillery rumbled like distant thunder. The Battle of the Bulge was 48 hours old, and the American front was collapsing. Colonel Reeder assembled his officers in a frozen barn near Bastogne on December 18th. The briefing was brutal. "Gentlemen, German forces have broken through in 3 sectors. They're driving for the Meuse River. If they reach it, they'll cut the Allied armies in half. Third Army is pivoting north to counterattack, but that leaves a massive gap. We're going to fill that gap with Phantoms." Captain Oscar Seal, commanding the Sonic Deception Unit, asked the obvious question. "Sir, if the Germans actually attack our positions, what do we do?" Reeder's answer was stark. "Die slowly enough for real units to arrive." The mission was Operation Koblenz, create the illusion that 2 full armored divisions were positioned to block any German advance westward, when in reality, the sector was defended by scattered remnants of units destroyed in the initial German assault. The setup, December 18th to 19th. The Ghost Army had 36 hours to create a deception more comprehensive than anything they'd attempted. They would simulate 6th Armored Division, actually refitting 90 miles away, 75th Infantry Division, en route from England, still days from deployment, supporting artillery and anti-aircraft units, Army-level headquarters coordinating the defense. They had to do this while German reconnaissance patrols operated freely in the area, while Luftwaffe aircraft flew overhead with impunity. Allied air superiority had been negated by terrible weather, and while actual combat raged less than 5 miles away. Private Bill Blass supervised deployment of inflatable equipment in conditions that made mockery of training exercises. Snow covered the ground, making it impossible to hide inflation equipment. Frozen rubber was brittle. Several tanks cracked during deployment. The cold made audio equipment malfunction. Recordings played at wrong speeds, creating sounds that didn't match real vehicles. Improvisation became survival. Problem: inflatable tanks sank into snow, looking obviously fake. Solution: cut timber to create tracks showing where tanks had driven to positions, then positioned inflatables at the end of these tracks. From aerial reconnaissance, it appeared tanks had maneuvered to tactical positions. Problem: frozen ground prevented driving stakes for guy lines on larger inflatables. Solution: filled jerry cans with snow, let them freeze solid, used frozen blocks as anchors. Problem: radio batteries died in extreme cold. Solution: operators kept batteries inside their uniforms against body heat, swapping frozen batteries with warm ones hourly. Sergeant Harold Laynor faced the sonic deception challenge of his career. His sound equipment was designed for temperate climates. At -10 degrees Fahrenheit, speakers cracked, recordings became brittle, and his carefully calibrated acoustic projections were distorted by snow cover and freezing air. His solution was to record new sounds in real time, using the few actual vehicles they had, creating live recordings of movement, then broadcasting these mixed with pre-recorded material. The result was imperfect, but imperfection sold the deception. The crisis, December 20th to 21st. On December 20th, a German reconnaissance patrol, 6 soldiers from the 2nd Panzer Division, stumbled upon a Ghost Army position near Arlon. Corporal Fred Fox, manning a listening post, saw them first. German soldiers moving through the tree line, approaching the inflatable tank company. If they got close enough to realize the tanks were rubber, the entire deception would collapse. Fox made a decision that violated every rule. He opened fire. His M1 Garand cracked 4 times. 1 German fell. The others scattered, returning fire. Within minutes, a firefight erupted. The Ghost Army's first direct combat engagement. Colonel Reeder, hearing the gunfire, faced catastrophe. Returning fire revealed their actual strength. A handful of soldiers, not a division. But not firing meant being overrun and captured. He chose a middle path, limited response that suggested a small outpost for a larger force, not the force itself. Ghost Army soldiers returned fire from spread-out positions, creating the impression of a company-strength outpost rather than a division. They used their few machine guns sparingly, firing short bursts from different positions to suggest multiple weapons. The German patrol withdrew after 20 minutes of sporadic fire. They radioed back that they'd encountered an American outpost and been repulsed. The German after-action report captured later read, "Encountered strong resistance from entrenched American forces. Vicinity Arlon. Enemy strength estimated company plus with armor support. Recommend against further reconnaissance without artillery preparation." The Ghost Army had fought its only battle and won through deception even in combat. The deception holds, December 22nd to 23rd. For 5 days, the Ghost Army maintained the illusion of 2 divisions blocking the western approaches to Bastogne. German forces, believing the sector was strongly defended, diverted their attacks north and south, exactly where real American forces had deployed to receive them. The psychological pressure on Ghost Army soldiers was intense. They could hear German vehicles moving at night. German artillery fell nearby, though never directly on their positions. Evidence the deception was working. The Germans were avoiding what they believed was a strong defensive position. They watched the sky for Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, knowing their deception had to withstand aerial photography. Private Arthur Shilstone described the experience in his diary. December 22nd, 10 degrees below zero. Germans are everywhere. We heard tanks last night, maybe 2 miles away. Our division consists of rubber tanks and foxholes. If they attack, we die. But they're not attacking because they think we're real. We're surviving by being a good lie. The weather that grounded Allied aircraft and gave Germans their offensive opportunity was the Ghost Army's greatest protection. Poor visibility meant German aerial reconnaissance was limited. Snow obscured details that might reveal the deception. The extreme cold kept German patrols close to their own lines. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. Allied aircraft returned to the skies. Patton's Third Army smashed into the southern German flank. The crisis began to ease. The Ghost Army received orders to withdraw on December 24th. They had held for 6 days. German forces never discovered they'd been facing phantoms. Casualties and near misses. The Battle of the Bulge cost the Ghost Army its first combat death, though not from enemy action. Private Robert Dahl, driving a truck loaded with deflated tanks during the withdrawal, skidded on ice and crashed. He died of his injuries on Christmas Day, 1944. The official records listed him as killed in action, though he never fired a shot at the enemy. Several soldiers suffered severe frostbite during the December operations. 3 lost fingers or toes to cold injuries sustained while deploying equipment in sub-zero temperatures. But the psychological cost was higher. The Ghost Army had always operated with the knowledge that they were unarmed deceivers in a combat zone. But the bulge made it real. They'd heard German tanks, taken fire, watched their friends suffer from cold and exhaustion. The unit's after-action report, filed January 3, 1945, contained a remarkable assessment. Unit morale remains high despite severe conditions and direct combat exposure. Soldiers understand their deception mission saves lives. Request recognition of unit's combat service. These men have earned combat decorations, though their achievements must remain classified. The request was denied. The Ghost Army's very existence was classified. Decorations would require explaining what they'd done, which couldn't be revealed while the war continued. The soldiers returned to their mission with no recognition, no combat infantry badges, no public acknowledgement. They were ghosts in every sense, invisible even in victory. Into Germany. Between January and May 1945, the Ghost Army conducted its final 4 operations as Allied forces pushed into Germany. Operation Viersen, March 1st to 4th, 1945, simulated Ninth Army's crossing of the Rohr River at a false location, drawing German reserves away from actual crossing site. The deception was so effective that German artillery pre-registered fires on empty fields, wasting thousands of rounds on phantom targets. Operation Buzonville, March 17th to 24th, created impression of major offensive building near Saarbrücken, while actual assault came further south. German intelligence diverted 2 divisions to defend against the phantom attack. Operation Exploit, April 15th to 17th, simulated armored spearhead threatening Bremen from the south, pinning German forces in position while actual Allied units bypassed them. Operation Lochinvar, April 26th to May 2nd, the Ghost Army's final mission. Simulated occupation forces in Czechoslovakia after real units had advanced deeper into the country. German forces in the region, surrounded but still fighting, believed they faced much larger Allied strength than actually existed and surrendered on May 7th rather than attempting breakout. As the war wound down, the Ghost Army's mission became less about tactical deception and more about preventing unnecessary bloodshed. Their phantom armies convinced German commanders that resistance was futile, encouraging surrender rather than last-ditch battles that would kill soldiers on both sides. Statistical accounting. The final numbers told a story of unprecedented success. Operations conducted, 21, not counting numerous smaller diversions. Divisions simulated, 13 different American divisions. Duration, in combat zone, 307 days, June 1944, May 1945. Total personnel, approximately 1,100 at peak strength. Casualties, 1 killed in action, vehicle accident, 7 wounded by enemy fire, 14 serious cold weather injuries. Equipment deployed, 600 plus inflatable vehicles, 40 plus sonic deception systems, sophisticated radio deception apparatus. Estimated enemy forces diverted, 15 to 20 divisions, 150,000 to 200,000 German troops. Estimated Allied lives saved, 15,000 to 30,000, based on casualty rates in sectors where deceptions prevented German attacks. But these numbers couldn't capture the psychological impact. German intelligence had been systematically fooled by artists with rubber tanks. The Wehrmacht's vaunted tactical expertise had been negated by creativity and theater. Classified until 1996. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The Ghost Army expected recognition, celebration, the acknowledgement any combat unit received. Instead, they received orders. All personnel of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops are hereby bound to secrecy regarding unit activities. No disclosure of tactical deception operations is authorized. Violation will result in prosecution under military law. The reason was strategic. The Ghost Army's techniques, inflatable equipment, sonic deception, sophisticated radio deception, were too valuable to reveal. The Cold War was beginning. These methods might be needed again. For 50 years, Ghost Army veterans couldn't tell their families what they'd done. They had no unit patches, no official combat recognition, no public history. When asked about their service, they learned to say, "Special operations." Can't discuss it. Many went to their graves having never told anyone about their extraordinary service. The breakthrough came in 1985, when veteran Rick Beyer began researching the unit for a documentary. Working with declassified documents and aging veterans, he slowly pieced together the Ghost Army's story. In 1996, the Army finally declassified the 23rd's records, though portions remained redacted even then. The sonic deception technology was still considered sensitive. Veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, could finally tell their stories. Many struggled to explain to families why they'd kept silent for half a century. Private Bill Blass, by then a world-famous fashion designer, rarely discussed his service. In a 1990 interview shortly before his death, he explained, "For 45 years, people asked what I did in the war. I'd say, Army stuff, and change the subject. How do you explain that you spent the war as an actor performing for an audience that would kill you if they caught you? It sounds like fiction, but it was the realest thing I ever did. Too late for most." In 2019, 75 years after D-Day, surviving Ghost Army veterans and their families gathered in Washington, D.C. for a long overdue ceremony. Of the approximately 1,100 men who served in the unit, Fewer than 20 were still alive. Most were in their late 90s. President Donald Trump authorized the Congressional Gold Medal for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, one of Congress's highest civilian honors. Senator Patrick Leahy, who had championed the recognition effort for years, read from the citation. For unique and highly distinguished service during World War II, conducting combat deception operations that contributed to tactical victories, saved thousands of Allied lives, and established the foundational techniques of modern battlefield deception. Bernie Bluestein, age 96, one of the last surviving members, accepted the medal on behalf of the unit. His speech was brief. "We waited 75 years for this. Most of my friends didn't live to see it, but we didn't do it for medals. We did it because rubber tanks saved real lives. If anyone asks what the Ghost Army accomplished, tell them this. We made the Germans afraid of phantoms. And while they were afraid of what wasn't there, they died fighting what was." The Ghost Army's Congressional Gold Medal now resides in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, alongside an inflatable Sherman tank and audio equipment used for sonic deception. Modern legacy. The techniques developed by the Ghost Army evolved into modern military deception doctrine. Inflatable equipment. Modern militaries use advanced decoys derived from Ghost Army designs. The technology is now sophisticated enough to fool radar, infrared, and electronic sensors. Electronic deception. Radio and electronic warfare units trace their techniques to the Ghost Army's pioneering work in signals deception. Psychological operations. The creative approach to making enemies see what isn't there became the foundation for military psyops. Combined arms deception. The Ghost Army proved that effective deception required integrating visual, audio, electronic, and human elements, a principle embedded in modern military doctrine. Field Manual 3-13.4, Army Support to Military Deception, published 2019, includes a historical case study on the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops as the foundational example of successful tactical deception. The Artist's War. What made the Ghost Army unique wasn't just their mission, but who they were. After the war, these soldiers returned to civilian life and shaped American culture. Bill Blass became one of America's most celebrated fashion designers, dressing first ladies and creating an American fashion aesthetic that competed with European houses. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most important abstract artists of the 20th century, with works in every major museum worldwide. Art Kane became a legendary photographer, famous for A Great Day in Harlem, his 1958 photograph of 57 jazz musicians that became one of the most famous images in American photography. George Diestel became a prominent fashion photographer, his work appearing in Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Life. Dozens more became successful designers, architects, advertising executives, and teachers. They carried the Ghost Army's lessons, that creativity could solve impossible problems, that imagination was a weapon, that art could change reality, into peacetime careers. In 2013, the Ghost Army Legacy Project, founded by Rick Beyer and Ghost Army veteran Bernie Bluestein, began collecting oral histories from the few surviving veterans. The recordings captured not just what they did, but what it meant. Harold Lehner, the sound engineer, aged 94 in 2013. "We proved that in war, the best weapon isn't always the biggest gun. Sometimes it's the best idea. We had ideas, and we made the Germans believe them." Arthur Shilstone, the illustrator, in his final interview before passing in 2015, "I painted pictures all my life, but the most important pictures I ever created were the ones that tricked the enemy into not killing my friends." Jack Macy, the designer, speaking at the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony, "We were artists who became soldiers, and we fought with paintbrushes, microphones, and inflatable tanks. We killed the enemy with their own imagination." Klaus von Müller, now 94 years old, stood in the same field where, 71 years earlier, he had photographed what he believed was an American armored division. He had traveled from Germany with his grandson, a professor of military history, to attend a memorial service for the Ghost Army. Beside him stood Bernie Bluestein, aged 92, who had helped deploy the inflatable tanks von Müller had photographed. "I studied your photograph in the German Federal Archives," Bluestein said. "You took it from that tree line, didn't you? About 0900 hours?" Von Müller nodded. "I was so proud of that reconnaissance. I thought I had discovered a major armored concentration. I recommended my commanders divert 2 divisions to defend against your attack." "We never attacked," Bluestein replied. The tanks you photographed were inflated at 0530 and deflated by 1100. They were in trucks heading to our next deception by the time your report reached headquarters. The German officer was quiet for a moment. For 70 years, I blamed myself for misidentifying Allied strength. I thought I had failed as an intelligence officer. Now I learn I was simply fooled by masters of deception. You were fooled by art students with rubber tanks, Bluestein corrected gently. But you weren't alone. We fooled everyone. Von Müller looked across the field, imagining it as it had been in 1944, filled with phantom tanks, phantom soldiers, a phantom army that diverted real forces and saved real lives. In the end, he said, you won the war twice, once with real armies and once with fake ones. I think the fake ones frightened us more. A real army you can fight, but how do you fight what you cannot trust to be real? Bluestein smiled. That was exactly the point. We made you question reality. And while you were questioning, we won. The two old men stood together in the French field, former enemies united by the strangest story of the war, the artists who became soldiers, the soldiers who became ghosts, and the ghosts who terrified an army. Behind them, a single inflatable Sherman tank stood on display, a monument to the unit that proved creativity could be as powerful as firepower, that imagination could defeat steel, and that sometimes the best weapon in war was making the enemy afraid of what wasn't there. The Ghost Army had been classified for 50 years, forgotten for another 25, and recognized too late for most of its members to receive the honors they deserved. But their legacy endures in every military deception operation, every PSYOPs campaign, every moment when creativity defeats brute force. They were 1,100 artists, designers, and dreamers who turned warfare into theater, made the impossible believable, and saved thousands of lives with rubber tanks and phonograph records. The Ghost Army fought with brushes, not bullets. They conquered with illusions, not invasions. And they proved that in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't always the one that destroys. Sometimes it's the one that deceives.